Okay, thank you for returning to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John, and thanks for coming back. Well, today with me I have Theresa Tallien. Teresa, I appreciate you coming on today. Do you want to we'll open it up and you'll tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your writing, your background, stuff like that, and we'll jump into it.
Yeah, sure. I'm Theresa. It's not my real name, but it's my Substack name. And I am a millennial. I'm in my mid-30s. I live in Chicago. I'm a freelance writer. I guess like really quick and dirty like bio. Like in the 2010s, I wrote about like music and entertainment stuff for a few publications like Spin and Noisy, which is part of Vice. But I kind of quit like the internet around 2017-ish and took a break. And I always had a day job. I worked in healthcare and a medical laboratory. So I just was kind of like offline for a few years and been dipping my toe back into being online again and started using Substack this summer. And I like to write about, whatever I feel like. I have a lot of interests, including literature, history, culture, aesthetics, politics, that stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I came across your writing. You're on a couple of different podcasts, including mutual friend of our Ancient Problems.
Yeah.
That was a really good one. So I've been kind of seeing you pop up on the timeline and reading your writing before that. I've been wanting to get you on. So this is I'm glad to finally talk to you. I guess one of the first things I want to zero in on is I'm also kind of a history buff. And at least for me, like history is such a good lens to view the present through and comparing and contrast. And your tagline is, and I believe you're 1790s liberal, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a joke because people today will use this term 90s liberal, and sometimes it's in a neutral way, and sometimes it's in a slightly disparaging way. I think when it comes from people on the right, it's like people like IDW or like heterodox type people sometimes get this label. I don't like blocked and reported, that type of liberal. And I don't mind when people call me that. It doesn't offend me, but I actually think I'm a little more right-wing than that. The term classical liberal has a lot of baggage that I don't like always like having, but that's probably a more accurate description of where my politics are. I do believe a lot in like individual liberty to the extent that I think a lot of like anti-discrimination laws are bad, and I believe in freedom of speech and radical freedom of association, and I tend to have more economically liberal or like center right views. So that's
I mean, that's kind of, you mentioned that you said the heterodox thing, and that was kind of the tagline that I used for myself, that when I first started writing, just I didn't really think too much about it. People you mentioned like Jesse Signal, or like Matt Taibbi, Anna Kasparian, people like that. Maybe it sounds like because we're having this conversation, like you can feel the same thing, where like you throw a little tagline out there, or like classical liberal, what have you, and it, like you said, it comes with so much baggage that people will read into it, kind of like a Rorschach test, whatever they think it's going to mean. So at a certain point, you have to either like over clarify it, over explain yourself, or just kind of own it. It's like, yeah, that's what it is, and that's what it means to me. So to that end, I've noticed you have written a lot about like gender dynamics, and like men's and women's issues. And I guess that would be, I spent a good chunk of today rereading your backlog just to kind of get me refreshed again. And you talking about like, some of the gender dynamics and modern dating, especially like, and forgive me, the exact title of the article was like, what was courting?
Yeah. What was courtship?
Yeah. What was courtship?
Yeah.
So that's something that I found really interesting. I mean, first of all, again, like me being a history buff, that's not an era in history that I've read a whole lot about, at least from like the social side of it, and like things like a calling card. I didn't know the etymology of that, and I had to look it up, and it was about literal calling cards and stuff like that. So I guess that's kind of one of the first things I want to jump into. Just what are your views? Like, how maybe did we go off the mark, or are we better off now? Or are we worse off now? Because maybe kind of as a prompt, it was making me think of, I don't know if you read this story recently. There was because you said you're a millennial, mid 30s. We're probably right around the same age.
Yeah.
So we grew up kind of right in the heart of, like, I would say, like, the total victory of the sexual revolution before things really started to um, maybe backslide, and there's been more and more discontents of the sexual revolution on both the right and the left, right? And I saw one news story that was like, there was this guy who was like 22, and he tried to like meet up on a Tinder date with a girl who was 18, and there's like this mob that came and like beat him up. And to me, that seems in some ways very, very wild, because like that's not that big of an age gap, at least to me. But also, like, I don't know if you've heard of or read Catherine D, The Default Friend, and she wrote about a little while back, like, the coming wave of sex negativity that we're seeing right now. So I guess kind of a long-winded way to say, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, it feels like we have gone into such a strange direction. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm married. I'm coming up in a couple months on an 11-year anniversary. I've been with my same, the woman that I love. But and I remember once hearing, like, people who got married or got with their partner, like, within the last 5 years. It feels like somebody who didn't show up to work on 9/11, because shit has gotten so crazy now. So where are you? What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, so I do think there were like genuine problems with the hookup culture that existed before the dating apps. And I think especially a lot of women don't like having casual sex, but at the same time, I think the dating apps have like turbocharged all of the problems, and the apps make it hard for women to find like a suitable partner for a long-term relationship, which is what most women are looking for, but also makes it like impossible for men to, I think, show off the traits that actually make them attractive to women, like their sort of embodied physicality, your sense of humor, the sound of your voice, the way you just interact. So I don't think it's good for anyone. And yeah, like you, I settled down with someone before those apps took off, and I do feel like very lucky for that, because I've seen a lot of my friends. I have friends who are like in their mid 30s, and they're still attractive women, and they aren't like losers, but they have not like settled down or found anyone. And I think that this online dating stuff has been bad for them, and I think that it's really increased like the incel population. If you look at how many young men are just like totally excluded from the dating market, it seems bad for everyone.
Yeah, it's a very, I guess, first of all, like, it's interesting that in some ways, it feels, I guess, depends on how far back in history you want to go, right? Because in some ways, like, it feels like this is a new thing, a new dynamic. But also, if you look at history, like, statistically, like, way back in time, like, most men wouldn't, like, breed and carry on, and the fact this pair bonding, the socially enforced monogamy and pair bonding was kind of, and I couldn't even give like a specific date. You could probably know, because for me, like, I love like ancient history, and like in the Bronze Age, like, unless you're a warlord with a harem, like, if you're just some guy who's, making clay pots, your chances of getting a wife are probably not great. So it's interesting that, like, in some ways it's hyper modernity, but also kind of going back to the norm for humanity. So I guess the two questions I have is, like, since specifically, like, when would you say that is that even something that's in your area of expertise from, what you read about? When did that start? And like, now that we've digressed, right? And I'm also interested, like, did you meet your husband in real life, or were you like an early dating app person? Because I met my wife on OkCupid, but this was like 10 years ago, when it was basically like Facebook plus dating, right? And I was, living in a small town in the Midwest in the time. I was living in a small town in Wisconsin, and there wasn't a great dating pool. So at the time, for me, it was great, right? Because we were able to find each other and normally wouldn't have been able to. But it seems like it's like a Frankenstein's monster where it's kind of totally gotten out of control.
Yeah. So for the first one, the spread of Christianity was the main reason why you see enforced monogamy in the West. And yeah, that's not the historical norm in a lot of cultures. And there are, like if you look in medieval China or in like the Middle East, there are just like huge numbers of men who are completely excluded from the sexual market. And yeah, that is in the Bronze Age. And I think even like the Romans had concubinage, and so many people were slaves, of course, so they wouldn't have had normal marriages. But Christianity, yeah, really enforced that as a norm. I think that monogamy is generally like good for the majority of women and men when it's like a social norm. So I'm a supporter. In terms of the dating apps, I met my husband in college, so we lived in the same dorm. We had a lot of mutual friends, and we dated for like 2 years, and then we kind of like took a break in our early 20s and got back together. And I've never actually really done like traditional online dating. I kind of like went out with a couple of guys who I like met on Twitter, but that's not really the same. I do think those old websites like OkCupid and like Match.com, I think that those kind of the process was slower, and it did seem to work a little bit better. I think like Tinder seems especially bad, like the swiping, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that, it's worse for both men and both women, but in different ways. Like, um, I once, the like the little blurb I had, like, especially, now, and it's not something I've experienced with, like, for a woman, you're going to have to like get 10 really shitty messages, and one of them, like, oh, this guy seems kind of cool, I could probably talk to him. And the other are like, show me your feet, or like, saying something crazy. Or like for a guy, you're going to have to like take 10 shots to even like get out. Um, even get a reply, right? And those things are obviously very related. And kind of, it made me think about how the way that men and women experience sexual attraction is very, very different. So yeah, it definitely feels like, it's not helping either gender really, right?
Yeah, and I actually think it gives people like a really like bad impression of the opposite sex. And you look at like people aren't hanging out together as much anymore. They're not like Zoomers seem like they don't like go out to like bars or clubs the way we did. Maybe they do, but to me it kind of seems like a lot of they stay home a lot. And I think if you're, especially if you're like a very online person, maybe you're a little bit shy or socially awkward, and your experience of the opposite sex is like through dating apps and through seeing like outrage, clickbait on TikTok or whatever, like it just breeds a lot of resentment between men and women, I think.
Yeah, there's a part of me that is very cynical, and like obviously, like a company like Tinder, if they're successful, then you will delete their app after a certain amount of time, so they have a vested interest. But also, so on one level you have that like cynical business side, but it also feels like it brings out like both the worst of men and women, like our, I don't even like ever, I don't know if I'm using like the anima or animus, whatever it is, like negative dark masculinity, negative dark femininity. And I'll see, and again, like I try, believe it or not, other than Substack, I'm not super online, and I haven't been for a while. But even then, I'll see like people like rage bait of like, a woman saying something really shitty, or a man being like insanely misogynistic in ways that are like past, like, because I was talking with I think you also know Lerpa Strike, and we were talking about how like there are things that you would say when it's just the boys, or you're just with the girls, about men or women, that you don't, these are like a private thing, right? You don't want to talk about that with everybody. And now that that's all out in the open, it's just these insane gender dynamics. And again, it brings back to that weird story of like something that would have been, even like a couple years ago, pretty normal. A 22-year-old guy going on a date with an 18-year-old girl. It to me, like, that's maybe you could say slightly skeevy, but I think 22 is right on the edge of like, okay, that's fine. You could meet each other in social circles organically,
Yeah.
but this lynch mob, it just seems so insane. And like, you wonder how we got here.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. I don't like when I first heard like there was all this age gap discourse, I imagined it was like people getting mad at like 50-year-old men trying to date like college students or something. And then you hear that it's like a guy who's like 25 tries to go with a 20-year-old, and people, that's normal. My friends in high school, like when we were like 17 or 18, I knew people who dated guys who were in college. It was fine. It's actually, I think guys mature a little bit slower, and also because of like the fertility window, it makes sense to want to have like a small age gap. I mean, my husband's only a year older than me, so that's not my personal relationship, but I think for a lot of people that does actually, that can be the ideal dynamic. And I think that when you look at like the guys who are like the most likely to be incels, they are sort of like these guys in this like 18 to 22 range, because who do you date? Like you can't date an 18 or 19-year-old girl. Like who else is there? The guys your age are dating guys who are like in the mid to late 20s. So just leaves these guys out in the cold for no good reason. When I was 18 or 19, I thought guys who were like 21 were, super cool and hot, and like, so I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, again, it feels like that was the historical norm. Like, obviously, you could say, like, right, there was gender inequality back then and whatnot. But at the same time, like, I think if, like, obviously, asterisks, homosexuality exists, whatever. But for the heterosexual pairing, like, I feel like that's a pretty normal thing to want. But there's this very, pathologized way of looking at these gender relationships that have kind of it feels very inorganic, and to me, like, that it's kind of like an uncomfortable truth, but like, if you look at media that women like and consume, it's usually a guy who's a little bit older, a little bit better off, and I don't know, maybe it's just that like it's so um transparently and transactionally laid out that I feel like maybe we're like subconsciously uncomfortable with. So there's a lot of talk right now about as you mentioned, um for a long time there was this attitude in like the more like liberal progressive circles, like, that gender is a complete social construct. There's a lot of things downstream from that, right? With like there's no real differences between sex and gender other than like the physicality of it, and everything else is completely socialized. But I think we're seeing that, like, as you mentioned, with the differences in sex and dating, and particularly with the online stuff. But I'm starting to see pushback from that, not just from the right, but from the left as well. And I almost think that like some of this is getting driven by some of the things you're talking about. And you're talking about, women who are a little bit older, maybe closer to our age, who feel like, because I feel like that's almost like a genre that I've seen on like YouTube or TikTok. Women are like, I was a feminist and I've been lied to by feminism. And, now I'm, 30 some odd, and I thought I was going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And I think part of it is, just we live in kind of a unique time in history as far as where we are economically and culturally and technologically, but also that like, that was, because again, we grew up in the 90s and the 2000s where things were pretty good and you could probably get away with it. But now that things are getting a little bit more difficult and down to the wire, it feels like we're starting to see pushback on that on either side.
Yeah, I guess that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I haven't actually seen that much of it from the left, but I'm sort of like, I don't really follow those spaces anymore. But I do think I have seen like the like millennial women who, I mean, I'm kind of like that. I think I was much more of a feminist when I was in my 20s, and I just sort of realized that I think like when you're in a relationship and you're both trying to do everything, it's like so much resentment can rise up and you're trying to do everything like 50-50. And it's kind of easier if you just have like, this is going to be what I do and this is going to be what you do. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you both can't have jobs or make money. I'm not saying that, because women have always worked as long as working has existed. But just to like, yeah, just to like not completely throw the baby with the bathwater out about like the gender division of labor in a relationship.
Yeah, it's I guess I'm curious to like, because at least to me, like in a lot of ways, I would definitely consider myself a feminist. And like, again, like 1990s definition, like up until like 2015, like I think women should be treated equally and have equal rights and be able to do what they want. And generally, I'm like pro-choice and stuff like that. But there, it feels like it's in some ways been kind of co-opted by like. I remember reading once, I hear a lot of people call it like, white woman feminism. And somebody said, that's what you used to call like bourgeois feminism that feels very careerist. And I remember, I guess I'm curious, like what feminist means to you and what it has come to mean. Because there was a while back, I was listening to this podcast. It was like a medieval history podcast. And then, it was this woman who was, very knowledgeable, had a lot of great, interesting things to say. And she was talking about like, back in like, the, 1300s or something, peasants, actually lived better lives in some ways because it was, a pre-capitalist society. And you would work less and there would be more organic gender roles. And then, but you had to do the kavats like, oh, well, they were basically baby factories, so they were oppressed. And I feel like that's not how those women would have seen it at that time, and not because they're not completely because they're like just illiterate peasants and didn't know how bad they had it, because pretty much everybody was an illiterate peasant. And it makes me think about how a certain wave of feminism maybe is starting to lose purchasing power, because I mean, I don't know about you, but I came from, I guess you could say, a more traditional family, and like my mom had a different role than my dad, but she was not unequal. Like my grandma was, kind of like a very much a matriarch, and she later in life, she worked and had a job, and she was a nurse, but also like she was also the head of certain aspects of the household and kind of went on to be like the matriarch of our family. And it was making me think about how, in most traditional communities, when you're not completely isolated like we are now, in these, everybody, back in the day, I say back in the day, but, 19 post World War II to like 15, 20 years ago, you could actually have it, go out, the man would work and the woman would stay home, but you're in an isolated home. And that definitely feels like, yeah, you would, if I was a woman, I would not want to be in that situation either. But you had more traditional communities where, you were around other women, you were around other men, and it was a whole ecosystem, and you would have your domain and the man would have his domain. So I guess that's my question to you. Like, where do you think that there's still things of modernity that are good and we can synthesize with aspects of traditionalism that are good? Because it feels like that whole like, yep, I will be an individual economic unit and we will, logically talk about I will do exactly 50% and you will do exactly 50%. That feels like more and more it's maybe not working for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's Mary Harrington who says like the problem with the trads is that they're not trad enough. And if you look at like pre-industrial times, that women were actually like economic households, especially the rise of like machinery that made textiles really displaced a lot of the importance that women had. So like your wife would have made most of your clothes, and that made her like valuable to you. And when those responsibilities were taken away because of these processes being industrialized and being made in factories, suddenly like the woman's only real role was reproductive. And I think that was very alienating to a lot of women. And caused, I think in some ways, men to be like more disrespectful to women. If you look at like some men's magazines from the 1950s, the way they talked about, men today, they all wish they could be like the 1950s husband. But if you actually look at how those men back then talked about it, they would often complain a lot, like, oh, I have to work all the time just so I can buy my lazy wife a new dishwasher. Like, she's just at home watching soap operas all day. And so I actually think that by taking away some of that utility from women, it's like, it's demeaning and it feels undignified. And I think that's a lot of that second wave of feminism was trying to like get that respect back, as well as the economic liberty of, having a paycheck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely feels like something that outside of even like, a romantic partnership, it was a give and take dynamic that we've kind of lost.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's confusing for most people not to have a clear-cut role. And obviously there are people who are very gender non-conforming. There are very feminine men and some very butch women out there, but that's not the majority of us. And I think that this confusion and this open-endedness, anyone can be anything. I don't think men or women really like that. And I do think a lot of women, myself included, feel that these like traditional feminine roles have been they're kind of like disrespected by this, like modern economy that you're talking about, where you're just an economic unit. And these things that women used to do, like being a big part of the church community, like taking care of old people, taking care of extended family members and things like that, that were really valued, just kind of seem unimportant now, or you're supposed to outsource them, supposed to pay an immigrant to do it instead.
Right.
And it's, I don't know. I think there are a lot of women who want to reclaim that stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, that's kind of part of what I saw, even on the left, because I have, like my wife is into like, the, like the research is like, the witchcraft thing. And it strikes me when she tells me about like, she's basically, they'll get together and they'll do like crafts and talk with each other. It's like, these are things that used to be a part of that, I guess feminine mystique, part of like what your power was. And you have to like reclaim it. I remember saying like, probably, I don't know if you remember in the early 2010s, there was like, women reclaiming baking. It's like, yeah, I'm a baker. I make cupcakes, but they're like punk rock. And I say like, fuck on the cupcake, like fuck the patriarchy. And it's, on one level, I get it. Cause like, I feel like, well, guys will do that too in our own ways, because we're trying to find any kind of way to reclaim identity and community in way, because it feels like in a lot of ways we're living in the leftover pathology of the baby boomer generation about all this weird stuff, and trying to find some way to, because I feel like that's the curse of the millennial generation, that we're like I said, we're so in the shadow of the baby boomer world that we can't do anything without multiple layers of irony, and it feels like it's really difficult to get out from under sometimes.
Yeah. And I think, not to sound like, now I'm going to sound like a leftist, but I think like in a capitalist system, like it all just sort of becomes consuming. It's all like, I'm going to buy this needlepoint kit from Etsy, or I'm going to buy, with men, it was like the epic bacon thing, right? It was like,
Oh God, the epic bacon, yeah.
But it just becomes like a purchases that you make, and I don't think it feels authentic. I think that's what we're like yearning for, but I don't know if we can fully get there. But yeah, I agree that I think like the boomers, they feel so proud of the changes that they made, that they really kind of like pushed their millennial children to like live these kind of like idealistic values that they themselves didn't fully live. The boomers, like a lot of them in their own personal lives still had like the old way of doing things influencing how they did it. And yeah, I think there was a lot of, I mean, my parents are pretty conservative, but I know a lot of people whose parents were more liberal that really like they really push their daughters to be like career women and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
it seems like self-serving in some ways.
Yeah. And kind of ironic too that like you talk about like in the 50s, these men's magazines, like these men talked about how much they hated their job. And I feel like they got resentment of their family because, oh, these, fuckers, I just got to work all the time so she can have the dishwasher and, the kids can have whatever. And we've kind of taken on kind of the worst of both worlds in that sense.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think men and women both like feel like they're getting the worst end of it, because a lot of women I know feel like, oh, I have to have a job and I have to do all this stuff at home. And a lot of men feel like I still have to do all the man stuff and like be a provider, but now I also have to help, with all these household chores that men didn't usually do. And I think both sides feel like they're getting a bad deal, which is not good.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely does seem like, again, like the capital incentive kind of poisons everything to a degree where you're completely isolated from, traditional communities where these things made sense. Like the male version of it, as I would sometimes see like these guys like, yeah, I only eat, steak and I drink raw milk. It's like, dude, you're buying your steak at a grocery store. It's not like you're going out to hunt this elk or you're raising the cow yourself. Like it's about as silly to me as like, these women who are like, oh yeah, I'm doing witchcraft and fighting the patriarchy, but you buy your witch books at Barnes and Nobles. You're so far removed from the cultural context that would have made these affectations have meaning. All we have left is like the simulacrum.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, I kind of think it's our job to just like fake it until we make it, though, as millennials, and maybe we'll bring something back that the future generations after us can have as their own. But I don't know. I think we're kind of doomed to like this postmodern like fakeness.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. We have to we're definitely in a lot of different ways in a transitionary period, politically, culturally, economically. And, it reminds me a little bit of the silent generation, which was, kind of had that same thing. Like they didn't get to fight in World War II, but, they still had to live in that world. But to kind of shift gears a little bit, like you and I are both in our mid 30s, and the aging millennial thing, and people talk a lot about the vibe shift, right? So it's very interesting to see, because were you always pretty conservative, or did you shift?
Yeah, I shifted. So my parents are pretty typical like Mitt Romney Republicans. My dad watched Fox News and like listened to Rush Limbaugh and stuff. And so I think like a lot of teens, I rebelled against my parents, and I like would read Michael Moore books to piss off my dad. And I went to a
Richard
very
Dawkins, all that stuff.
yeah. I was a new atheist teen. My mom hated. And then I went to a liberal arts college, where I would say like the average student was like a gay anarcho-communist. So like I was right wing at that school because I was just sort of like a normie liberal. And in my 20s, since I worked in at least part-time, I was writing for these digital publications. A lot of those people were also very far left. And so I think kind of I drifted that way a little bit at first. And I think with like the woke stuff, like at first some of it just seems like common sense, like don't touch a black person's hair. It's like, well, who would do that? That's weird. Like don't
touch anybody's hair that you
don't call
don't know. Like,
people
how would
racial
you do that?
slurs. It's like, okay, sure, that makes sense. And then like 2 or 3 years later, it's like if you're a white person and you wear a kimono, you're a racist. And it escalated quickly. And I became a little bit reactionary to that. I think the 2016 election was like weird for me because I wasn't really like in the Bernie thing because I'm not a socialist, but I also like found Hillary Clinton to be really lame and cringe. And I also like that Trump was really bad too. I probably had like some TDS. But I thought everyone just seemed kind of insane. And it was around that time that I got offline, and I just tried to stop thinking about politics so much and I was like, I'm going to be a normal person. And I don't know if I am a normal person, so that was kind of faking it also. But I kept following politics and listening to podcasts and stuff around that time. And then in 2020, that was like my red pill moment, because there were George Floyd. Yeah, there were George Floyd riots like in my neighborhood, like right outside my apartment, like storefronts, with glass broken and stuff. And I would go out, like talk to my friends about it, and they'd be like, no, it's good actually. Like riots are good. And I'm like, no, it's like scary that there's broken glass like on the sidewalk and I'm trying to like walk to my car. So that I started listening to Alex Kashuta.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah, and that, I think my politics moved a lot further to the right around that time.
Yeah. Well, again, it feels like, I don't know, at least to me, like what left and right mean the goalposts have moved so much. Because at least to me, like, I feel in a lot of ways, like the left and the right as they existed in, say, like the 20th century don't really exist that much anymore. It's more cultural affectations. And kind of like you said, for me, like more coming from the left, in a lot of ways, I still consider myself kind of lefty, just because like, wow, I don't think we should be in all these unnecessary wars, or I think like we should take care of workers and stuff like that. Like, yeah, like there are still like historical issues of racism that, I don't think you can deal with it by like, having struggle sessions with like, corporations, doing, the race and gender day, which seems to make everybody feel weird and uncomfortable, and only like school marmy people and grifters seem to like it. But yeah, that was 2020 was my moment too, because I guess I had a lot of frustration with people on the left who are very, how do I want to put this? Like, they didn't have a lot of experience that was outside of like, okay, I kind of like you talked about, I went to come from a very liberal family and went to a very liberal college and don't live in the real world. Because for me, like I would during the pandemic, I was an essential worker, but I was an essential worker because of the nature of my job. I also had to travel. So it was very weird to travel during 2020 during COVID, and flying during COVID was very weird and probably like one of the most isolating experiences I've ever had in my life. But at the same time, like you said, the seeing riots and stuff like that, we're like, okay, because my family is from Milwaukee and that's where they live, and there's riots like a mile from where I lived. It's like, okay, this was a terrible thing that happened, but also like excusing violence like that seems like you're going down the wrong path, And I feel like a lot of people had those moments where they either doubled down or they found some kind of weird middle position, kind of like you said, I'm not engaging with this. I'm going to try to live in the real world, or their brains just completely broke,
Yeah. Not only was like the justifications of the riots like really alienating to me, but I also remember from that time is like the only real changes that happened were like the guy from Bon Appetit getting fired, and like,
yeah,
like it's a lot of like sort of like upper middle class media people like losing their jobs for not really like strident, like really adhering to this very narrow definition of anti-racism. And it was I don't think like any real meaningful changes happened other than the police stopped policing as much, which I live in Chicago. It's been terrible. Like there's tons of carjackings are up, and like road accidents and stuff are up because they just don't pull people over as much anymore. So it seems like it's just been really bad.
Are you from the Chicago area originally, or did you move there?
I grew up in Indiana, and
okay.
I went to college in Michigan. Then I moved to Chicago in 2011.
Okay, so also a Midwesterner like me.
Yes.
Me, you, and Lerpa Strike will have to have a Midwestern talk hour one of these days.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, but in the meantime, yeah, that was definitely again one of the things between that and the restrictions around COVID and everything. But kind of like you said, like did anything actually come from it other than it just felt like an outlet for middle class anxiety. So much of this stuff was like, at least, I don't know any black people personally who are like, oh, wow, yeah, this is, you took an episode off of Netflix of a TV show that was kind of racially insensitive. Like, oh, thank God, free at last, that God Almighty were free at last, right? So much of it was just like a passion play for liberal white people to show how liberal they were. I don't know if you've heard of there's a writer called Peter Turchin um who writes about, like, the best way to think about wokeness is a crisis of elite overproduction. Like, we've had way too many college degrees, like way more college degrees, and then there are positions for those college degrees, which I feel is one of the main millennial experiences. And so it's a way for you to be able to move up in an overcrowded field. Because as you probably know, also historically, like up until World War II, university was, if you were already rich, you go to a university and you're going to get into the family business and you do 4 years of literature, or you're going specifically for, I'm going to be a doctor. And now that's kind of what I see with some of the gender studies stuff, or race and gender studies in like the literature and media landscape. Because honestly, like when you're in these situations, I mean, granted, take this with a grain of salt because I didn't go to college, but what I see, like, there's only so much you can talk about, the Iliad or, Jane Austen whatsoever before, like, there's not much more to say. And then it's a great way to get ahead. It's like, well, actually, what about, colonialism and Jane Austen? It's like, is that really in scope? But, if you want to get a job at a literature, in a literary department, that's a great way to do it. Or I think another example I heard somebody say is like, you saw all these firings of, in some cases, like very real abuses of power and, just horrible sexual misconduct. But also sometimes we're like, okay, are we to really believe that, like, say academia or the news media is like Mad Men, basically, where it's like horribly sexist, or is there just like not a lot of positions and this is a great way to get ahead?
Yeah. I definitely believe that theory. I just read Musa Al-Garbi's book about a month ago, and it kind of touches on similar themes. He talks about symbolic capitalism. And I definitely saw that, like, in digital media. I never made enough money doing freelance writing to like quit my job. A lot of people don't realize maybe, but like these articles, if you write like an album review for Pitchfork or something, you get like $300, and it's like way more hours of work. You're making less than minimum wage, actually. And so the only way to like make a go of it is to get like a staff writer position at one of these places, and they still don't pay that well, but it's very coveted, and there's not very many. And the number of people who want to do these jobs, because writing is fun, and like writing about pop culture and stuff is, and getting paid for it, like, it's awesome. I know why a lot of people want to do it, but with the rise of the internet, the media was collapsing. Like magazines and newspapers were all folding, and you have all these digital sites that are paying like rock bottom. And when you want to be in that club and you're not, and like I worked at a hospital, my job was like, it was hard, and I was jealous of people who got to just spend all day writing and listening to music and reading books and stuff. And when I would see someone, like if I would see some guy who had like a staff writer position somewhere and he would, do a sexism, like even I would feel like tempted to be like, oh, gotta roast this guy, take him down a notch. And I just think that the shrinking pool really incentivized that stuff in media in particular.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where, like, I always try to be measured in these criticisms, because on one level, you see, I don't know if you follow this type of thing, but like Neil Gaiman got called out recently. Called out is not like a strong enough term, because he seems like a genuine predator. But like you said, like, there's also at the same time, you see, it's like, okay, I never want to, like, say, oh, that didn't happen to you. But also at the same time, like things that seem like minor infractions, or, something that you would like, okay, this is something you talk about, something you work out. But when you, take it to the public like that, it I guess to me, like whenever somebody was like, okay, these are institutional things that I'm being oppressed in this specific way, we need to change these laws. That's one thing. But I feel like a lot of people, even more so now, I feel like even with like the election of Donald Trump, and he made gains in every demographic except, the only place that like Democrats gained was old liberal white people. So it feels like they're, this whole like, I'm using social justice to get a raise or to get a promotion. I feel like it feels just kind of gross to a lot of people, because I
Yeah.
remember seeing on Substack, it was this woman, it was an Asian woman who was a doctor, and she had this sticker like, pay me like you would pay a white man. It's like, statistically speaking, you make more money than a white man, it feels very disingenuous. And I think that's what bothers a lot of people, like all these middle class strivers who use identity markers but don't actually look at like your actual material conditions.
Yeah, and I think that, and look, like my family was fairly well off. My husband's an engineer, so I'm not trying to like pretend class, because I'm not, but I did work like in a commercial laboratory where a lot of my coworkers did come from sort of like a lower middle class background. A lot of them went to community college. There's lab assistants and stuff like that. And I saw it was also like a very racially diverse workplace. I live in Chicago, and there's, white people, Filipino people, Hispanic people, Black people, all working together. And like, it mostly just worked. Every now and then somebody would say something that, HR would have to come in and say, you can't say Indian people smell like curry or whatever. But for the most part, people, would joke around and have like camaraderie, and it wasn't a big deal. And I have to imagine, if you are someone who works in a warehouse or in a factory or in an auto shop or something, like this stuff seems insane.
Yeah. Well, I mean, definitely that was my experience. Like, again, I didn't go to college. For a long time, I worked as a chef, and it was kind of that thing where like sometimes something off color would happen, but you had to mediate it yourself. Like I feel like you learn those boundaries like very organically. Because I mean, I feel like this is maybe a hot take that like, you know, hear me out on this. I feel like women, I don't think there's very few situations where a man should hit a woman, but I think women should hit each other more, because I feel like as a guy, you learn from a pretty young age, talk shit, get hit. You learn, okay, maybe I should say some things to some people, not to others. But it feels like very much in these very HR mediated spaces where people, particularly like, very liberal white people, and I hate to say it, but more, female heavy industries, where like you're just not used to these things. And like in a different time, like, okay, you say something awkward, maybe it is like, the girl from Idaho who thinks she can touch a black person's hair. You're going to have that conversation. It's going to be awkward and uncomfortable, but you're going to figure it out. And she's not going to fucking do that again. And people are just so afraid to have a social faux pas that they have all these like, HR mediation things that like, again, like I don't know anybody who's like, black people, gay people, whatever. Some people, you're going to get those occasional people who like, I think if you create an avenue for success, some people are going to take that and use it cynically, but most people just like don't like that. And it feels very weird and inorganic. And for me, I've worked in factories or as a chef, and now I work as an engineer, but I didn't go to college for it, and I was able to just work my way up. And it's a very weird situation to be in sometimes, when I grew up, even like, working in the field, and I've, worked my way up to an engineering position. There's a very clear delineation from the people who learned by doing and the people who had that more traditional academic track, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I think white women in particular, it's like this combination of like the female way of resolving conflicts combined with that's like, white women are so afraid of being called racist. I think like more than men are. And so I think that like a lot of the craziest woke stuff, you know, sort of came from like white women who were very afraid of often like Indian women or very well-to-do Black women who would try to like push them out of the spot, and they try to stay on top by being, you know, Robin DiAngelo, and I think that's where a lot of this comes from.
Yeah. And again, that's why it's so much of it feels very inorganic to me. And that's why, I don't know if you've been following, like, you know, recently Mark Zuckerberg, he's like, hey, I'm a cool bro now. And hey, you know, actually, there are only two genders. And hey, the workplace has gotten too feminine. It's like, dude, a couple of years ago, you were on the exact opposite train. And I'm seeing all, because I work in the tech world now, and I've been doing this for like 5 or 6 years. And to a certain degree, I was, because of the nature of what I do, I'm not a software engineer. I'm more on the infrastructure side. And I would sometimes like go to construction sites. So you didn't see that too much. But when I was in one of my last jobs was I was in a startup, and that was very much the case where like just seeing the contrast of like the leadership was pretty much all white guys that had one Black dude and one woman. They were all absolute pieces of shit, but that all, you know, oh, let's have our pronouns, and we're going to do these, you know, these struggle sessions where we'll, you know, everybody has to watch the diversity stuff, and we talk about it in these like Zoom meetings we would do together. Meanwhile, like, you know, there's talks like sexual harassment and just these, you know, still being an absolute boys club. And funny enough, like the only one like I respected was the Black guy, because he had open disdain for the IT department, which I kind of like, because everybody else would, like, you know, be nice but also treat us like shit. But he had open disdain for us, which is nice. And I wonder if like he just got, you know, too cynical and saw too much of that bullshit. Because now it's Mark Zuckerberg. You're seeing this very inorganic shift of like, you know, oh yeah, we're, you know, again, like doing more cultural right affectations, and current thing has changed. And I think like it's just such a whiplash, and it feels so very inorganic.
Yeah, Zuckerberg in particular, like you can tell he like hired a stylist and an image consultant or something to pull this off. It was very weird that
How to look human.
Yeah. That picture of like Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg, like all at the Trump inauguration, was very trippy to me.
Yeah. Well, especially because even like, you know, Musk is the darling of the right now. It's like, guys, do you not remember like not that long ago, he was like a big Democratic donor and everything? And I don't know. I guess, what are your thoughts? Because I'm very, to me, like, I try not to think too much about Elon Musk. Or to me, like, having an opinion on an individual billionaire is like having an opinion on an individual tropical storm. Like, it's so much greater than you that like what you can, you know, you can have your takes on it, but at the end of the day, it's going to do what it's going to do. But I can't decide, like, do you think Elon Musk is genuinely like a autistic shitlord like that, or is he just saw that that was a market that wasn't being catered to and an avenue to power? Because to me, like, I can't make heads or tails of it myself. Like with the whole supposed Nazi salute, whether or not he's just like, again, a legitimately autistic guy who was caught in an awkward moment, or he was like doing a dog whistle to, you know, try to appeal to right-wing people. It almost doesn't matter to me. But what do you think? Is it cynical, or is he just like legitimately like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Zuckerberg and Bezos are completely cynical. I do think Musk was genuinely kind of like radicalized by, like, I think he's a Twitter addict, and so he bought Twitter. But I think like the censoriousness and the wokeness on Twitter, and his own kid being trans, like actually, I do think he was genuinely radicalized. I think the Nazi salute was a troll. That would be my best guess, but man, who knows with that guy? Yeah, I think that's a good point about viewing the billionaires as kind of like they're just like a force of nature. What I find like I hate is like the people who worship Musk. It's so like cringy and embarrassing to me, especially a lot of people on the right like still. Oh, it just grosses me out.
Yeah, well, especially after the H-1B incident, where, you know, this is going to come out in probably about a month, so this might be way past the news cycle. But like, yeah, we ran on, anti-immigration, but just kidding. We want a whole bunch of immigrants to come in because I don't know how much you know about the H-1B system, but like even like I feel like if you're a lefty, you should be against just because it is. I was talking to this Indian he's a senior software engineer and he's making like $20 an hour. And it is highway robbery the way that these people are basically, semi-slave labor, that they will contract these people and they're completely tied to one employer so they can't quit. And it's not good for it's not good for them. It's not good for people in America. It's only good for somebody like Elon Musk. It's like, oh, well, he did a Nazi salute, or, he's saying based things on Twitter. And it just feels very like, to me, how are you falling for this? I don't know. Maybe I'm too cynical, but again, it just seems like if you were doing something so different so recently, but yeah, I guess maybe he is just a Twitter addict. It feels a very strange place in culture where like, we have a president who is a Fox News addict who, he's kind of, I feel like, in the past, like, I don't think George W. Bush watched Fox News or, Mitt Romney, but, a president who's getting high from his own supply, and Elon Musk, who's a Twitter addict. And it's just such a weird place in culture where the other side of it is I'll see people like on the right who will be like, oh yeah, Elon Musk, he's so great, but fuck George Soros. Or people on the left who are like, Elon Musk, he's so terrible, he's a Nazi. Oh, George Soros is a billionaire, but he does like, funds like trans stuff, so he's good. And it feels like we've just gone back to like feudalism, or like you're just picking a feudal lord to, put your hopes in.
Yeah, I guess that's true. That's pretty dark.
Yeah.
The H-1B thing, really, I'm not opposed to all forms of skilled immigration. Sometimes we need it, but I also think after the financial crisis, especially like the Obama administration really pushed like STEM really hard, and computer science became a very popular major. And I also know, like, my husband's a software engineer, and the hiring environment has been pretty bad these past few years. It's gotten a little better this year, but like in 2022, 23, there were tons of layoffs. And also like with AI and stuff, like streamlining a lot of how code is made and how like bug fixes are done. Like the idea that like we need more software engineers just doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, other than like, you can get some people for very cheap. I think you just throw a lot of people at the problem. That's kind of what I see. I have I support an offshore team for the infrastructure that I do. And some of them are great, but like, some of them, they just have dog shit code, and I have to like explain basic Linux to them. And again, in some ways, like I do feel resentful, but other ways I feel a lot of empathy towards them because they're not in a good situation either. But I think that's another example of the vibe shift, the realignment, because even like, I know you said you weren't a fan of Bernie Sanders. I wasn't a fan in 2016. He was my guy in 2020. He's since kind of, I think, humiliated himself in a way that's very disappointing. But I remember like not that long ago, Bernie Sanders was saying that open borders are a Koch brothers conspiracy, basically. And, the way that people are being mistreated both in America and, it would be like, if you were somebody like, say, for example, Elon Musk, open borders and, easy to, cheap and easy to exploit labor is like your dream come true. So that's something that I feel like very cynical about. And I wish some, because I have, some right leanings too. Because I mean, again, like I'm kind of hawkish on immigration, which to me used to be a left position, but I guess is right wing again. I would be, cautioning some of my friends on the right, like, okay, maybe let's be a little bit more critical of this and not just allow just because this guy is doing something culturally that you like to do something, to get away with all this stuff. Because you were around the same age. Do you remember the Occupy Wall Street stuff?
Yes.
And right around then is where they really started to ramp up all the woke stuff. And it felt like it was, I don't know if it was done on purpose or just kind of that's how, because, somebody like, Curtis Yarvin talks about the cathedral, but also like, there's that old George Carlin bit about, a conspiracy isn't required where interests converge. And I don't know if it's A or B, but it kind of feels like that's what's happening right now.
Yeah. Again, that Musa Al-Gharbi book, he talks about how actually like Occupy, like a lot of the sort of early like like I guess they called it SJW back then, right?
That takes me back.
Some of those politics actually really spread within Occupy because the whole percent. So you had a lot of working class people who were involved in Occupy, but you also had a lot of like middle class people who had student loans, who were having trouble finding the white collar job that they thought they were promised. And I think those people kind of brought in their SJW politics. And in some ways, Occupy was like a ground for spreading those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, it definitely felt like it was something that was subverted. And again, like I would agree with you, a lot of this stuff, like the seed of it was good, and I have a lot of sympathy for it, and I would generally agree with it. But once it became a way for people to kind of get ahead, then it becomes a little bit more cynical, and I feel a little bit more mistrustful of it. But that actually kind of brings me to something else I was going to bring up to you that you brought up, doing the culture writing. And I'm curious to how you saw that shift, because you kind of mentioned it. You saw, it feels like people were using it in a very cynical way to get ahead. And I remember being in like, the indie hipster music scene in like 2011 and reading Pitchfork. And I saw a comparison of like, 2013 top 10 Pitchfork albums were all like, indie bands that nobody had heard from Portland. And like by 2018, it was all like Beyonce and Jay-Z and stuff like that. And it felt, again, very inorganic. Did you ever, because you're in that world, did you ever listen to Anthony Fantano?
I've seen him. Yeah, I've seen some of these.
Because he went from like a kind of edgy shitlord guy when he first started reviewing music, and he did stuff with like Sargon of Akkad and did an AMA on 4chan. And this might be wrong. I think he might have done some stuff with like Sam Hyde too. There was this article that was written about him, like a hit piece, that he was a racist because he made memes and stuff like that. And now this guy is like super, super woke, doing stuff with like Hassan Piker. And it feels just, again, so very inorganic to me. And I was wondering, like, what was your experience like with that? Because to me, it went from like, oh yeah, if I'm hip and cool and show how cultured I am, I like, the Decemberists or Joanna Newsom. And now it's like, oh, that's, white privilege or whatever, and indie is bad. And now you have to show, listen to top 40s hip hop to show how cultured and woke you are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm kind of guilty of being part of that. I don't think it was totally inorganic. I think that there was like a weird shift that happened. There's this kind of like indie sleaze culture that sort of, I talked to Ancient Problems about this kind of like era when there's like, people would call it like indie dance music, and it was stuff like Justice and like, I don't know if you remember, like mashups were really popular at like parties and stuff. And
yeah,
there's a lot of like
Sleigh Bells was one, a big one in that genre,
and stuff like that. And there's a lot of sort of like alternative dance music and pop music, and a lot of like hipsters also like kind of became like wiggers around that time. And I think there was a lot of interest, like first in sort of like underground regional street hip hop and stuff like that. But I think that as these magazines started to lose money and they wanted to maintain access to like major label recording artists, they start like reviewing them more positively. I also think that because of Twitter and like Stan Twitter, like if you wrote a negative review of a Beyonce album or a Taylor Swift album, you'd get like death threats, like, and like people trying to dox you and like crazy stuff. So I think nobody like wanted to write negative reviews of those albums. Like people would refuse to because they just didn't want the pressure. And then the review goes to somebody who likes that album. And so they all end up being positive reviews. So I don't actually think it's like, I think it actually was very organic the way it happened.
Okay. It's interesting you say that because I remember I had a podcast with Monia Ali and she
Mhm.
talked about that, how like it to me it seems so crazy like to me something like One Direction or Taylor Swift, like it seems so insane to have death threats over something like that. But it yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about it from that angle because again, maybe again the profit motive. Um because forgot where I was going with that, but any more experiences with that? Because
Yeah, I mean, Charlie XCX, whatever her name is, she
Mhm.
like famously tweeted some really mean stuff about someone who wrote like a mildly critical review of her and like basically sicked her fan base on this reviewer. And I mean, even like a review of something that I wrote, and I was never like a big deal, but like Grimes didn't like a review that I wrote about someone who was sort of like one of her friends. And like, you do just get like dogpiled really bad. And I think it discourages people from taking those assignments.
yeah, I wonder if that's why. Because at least, I mean, I'd be curious to know how into this type of thing you still are. Like, at least to me, there's not been like a lot of new music that's really grabbed me because it's either the biggest possible appeal that you could have, like Taylor Swift, or hyper niche. Um, and again, like the culture around critique has gotten so tiring. And I think I hadn't noticed it until Monia pointed it out, and you said it as well, how overwhelmingly positive everything is. It's harder to take it seriously because it weirdly enough, like I was watching like an old interview with Howard Stern and like Dave Grohl, and I would start off by saying I really don't like Howard Stern. Like I feel like that's a cultural artifact that I just kind of you had to be there at that time. Because it's not like he's offensive to me because I grew up online and I saw like things that were many orders of magnitude more edgy and offensive than that by like 12. But that kind of like, hey, yeah, we got some girls, they're mud wrestling in the studio today. And yeah, you can't see it, but take my word for it. It's super hot. But he was critical and not in a way that was rude, but actually asked poignant questions and actually asked, things that were challenging in a way that I was just really taken aback by. You don't really see that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's to a certain extent with album reviews, it's like they don't have as much of a purpose before. So like before the internet, or even like into the 2000s, like I always got Spin magazine and I would read it and then I would go and like buy the CDs based on, like whatever Chuck Klosterman said was good. And you wouldn't be able to hear the album. Maybe if you maybe you were able to pirate it. But once I think streaming comes online, it's like, what's the point of an album review? It's like, maybe if you're a really thoughtful person, you want to hear someone else's opinion, but most people just want to hear their own opinions validated back to them. And there's not much of an incentive to be critical. If you think about it this way, like if you write a positive review of, I don't know, like Olivia Rodrigo or something, like a lot of her fans might follow you. And if you write a negative review, then that's not going to help you build your platform at all. So being just like really obsequious is incentivized.
Yeah. And I see that in the literature world as well, that these big artists or these big writers will just get so much in an echo chamber that I guess I suppose it's good work if you can get it right. Like if I could get, I don't know if you're into fantasy literature very much, but like an author like Brandon Sanderson is really big, and he has a very specific fan base that I've listened to interviews by him. He will do beta readers and he will change based on the taste of his beta readers. And on one level, like it's good work if you could get it, but at the same time, like it just feels like you can get so siloed in, which, if you're somebody who's that big, it's great, but it feels like it's become harder and harder for newer artists or musicians or anybody to break through because of that.
Yeah, I think there's I keep hearing like with like book publishers, they expect you to have like an online platform before you can even like get your book in front of an agent, which is crazy to me.
Yeah, I have a good friend who's a published writer, and it was funny, that was his exact experience. Like, yeah, you have to have XYZ follower count already. And it's like, well, why do I need you exactly then? Like, what if I had that level of reach, why would I be coming to a publisher? I could just indie publish it and buy it directly. So again, it feels like these institutions that are just kind of dying and trying to hold on to relevancy, that, you know, I feel like institutionally they just don't have the validity that they used to. Like, you know, of course, like somebody like Taylor Swift is huge, but I'm trying to think, at least to me, a really big artist that's come out in the last 10 years that everybody knows. Because you mentioned Charlie XCX, and that's some of it's supposedly huge. I've heard like 2 songs by her, and there was a time, like, you know, when we were growing up, I wasn't like a Beyonce or Coldplay fan, but I could tell you songs by Beyonce and Coldplay. Gun to my head, I don't think I could tell you more than one Charlie XCX song, and I couldn't tell you like the actual title of the song. I'd have to like sing it in a really bad voice.
Yeah, it's really easy to just like totally avoid that stuff. You don't have to listen to the radio anymore. You can just put on your playlist. You can listen to your favorite album from 10 years. And also when you're in your 30s, like, I think it's normal to kind of, like, you've already heard a lot of music. Do you need...
Yeah, that's true. I'm not willing to rule out the fact that I'm just getting old.
Yeah.
But many such cases, what are you going to do? So, starting to wind down a little bit. I guess I am a little bit curious because there's a lot of talk about the vibe shift, and particularly like in the last month or so, things really seem to have changed pretty seismically culturally. Like, again, we're talking about like some of these tech people who are now signaling right. This is something me and Ancient Problems talked about. Everybody go listen to that if you haven't already, about, you know, something I've termed like, you know, magesploitation, or I call it hillbilly elegy core, that it feels like that might be the next big thing, that like there's either like a demographic that hasn't been really marketed to in a while, or it's just could be the next big thing. Like, where do you see, like, you know, the next, we'll say the next 4 years, because that's a presidential term, like culturally, politically, where do you, or even like gender dynamics, where we talk, where do you see any of this going? Do you have any predictions, or like, you know, where we think the wind is going?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw sort of the like 90s, 2000s style, like raunch culture type of stuff come back. If you think about like the Opie and Anthony show, or like the Man Show, that type of humor, wouldn't be surprised to see that become mainstream again. I think that people will, you know, like making offensive jokes and stuff is kind of back. I'm curious to know like how long the vibe shift is going to last, because in some ways, like, there's a vibe shift around 1980-ish when Reagan was elected, and you could argue that that vibe shift lasted for like 30 years. And yes, there was like political correctness in the late 80s, and the 90s were sort of a liberal time in some ways aesthetically, but at the same time, like the Gen Xers were have a very like tough, laissez-faire, like I have a thick skin and nothing offends me sort of attitude that I think persisted, you know, even in the liberal 90s. And so I'm curious if it's like this is a small thing that's going to just last during the Trump term, or are we in for kind of like a longer backlash to the wokeness of the 2010s, which I don't know if you ever read like the Political Tribes survey, but like only like 8% of people were like actually really woke. So I'm not surprised that the tide on this has turned. People were starting to get sick of it, and I think like the Bud Light thing, like the transgender Bud Light thing, like that was a really big sign that like that this demographic has like they have power to push back against these brands.
Yeah, I do wonder, because like I said, at one level it feels very inorganic, but also like the way, as you know, as you probably know, the way history works, it's not always like a really long cycle. We're going to do 20, 30 years, whatever it is, of one cultural moment, and then it organically shifts, and it's the exact same amount of time. especially like with the way modern technology works. It's something that compounds and goes faster and faster. Um, and I think you're right. Like, I feel like a lot of people did it very cynically. And I think a lot of people, I mean, it's sad to say, but I think most people would just go the way the wind is blowing. I don't think like, they're stupid NPCs. I think most people like are just trying to live their life and go along and like live in the real world. Um, but that having been said, it does feel like there's been kind of a significant change, because I've always felt that liberalism is an affectation of peace and plenty. And we're going into difficult times, and maybe people are going to kind of react against that, because I think it's easy to be, and again, I think a lot of the stuff behind it had its heart in the right place. And it's easy to do that when everything's easy. There's a lot of money and it's easy to make it. But when there's less and less positions, I think people are going to get like more and more, in some ways, like openly cynical and identitarian in ways that like, are not hiding behind like, oh, I'm doing this for justice. It's, I want more money and I want to have it. And if I don't, if you get it, I don't get it,
Yeah, I remember like one thing that people who were opposed to, woke back like 10 years ago would say like, that they would warn that it was going to cause a backlash, and like having these, like if you have everyone go into a racial affinity group, including the white people, and you make the white people suddenly think about the fact that they're white people, like, what are you awakening? And now I think we're sort of like past the point of no return on that. I think like men are thinking about the ways that they're being discriminated against in certain, more word-sally white-collar industries. And I think that white people are racially activated in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. And I think that's just here to stay for at least the near term.
It's one of those things like I've been trying to find a way to write about. Like, I would agree with you. I don't even think it's a good thing, but I think it is what it is now, especially when you tell people like, wow, Donald Trump is a white supremacist and a racist, and he's for only white people, and more than half of the country voted for him, even people who weren't white. I think there's, like you said, an activation that happened there that would not have happened, might not have happened otherwise. And that's something that's going to be a difficult thing to come with, to deal with in the coming years, I think, for sure. And it's a very uncomfortable truth that I think we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I think it's going to be weird the next few years, and I don't know what to say.
Yeah. So I guess on that note, as we're coming to the end of our time, do you have anything coming up that you want to promote? Any pieces, any other podcast appearances, anything you've done recently you want to plug?
Yeah, I wrote a post pretty recently about pheromones and attraction and compatibility, and I'm a big believer in like the pheromone theory, and I link to a lot of cool studies about it, and I talk a little bit about like the history of sexuality too. I read this really great book that was like all about sex in the 18th and 19th century that I could probably get like 3 or 4 really good blog posts about. So maybe I'll write a little more about that, and definitely also listen to my appearance on the Ancient Problems blogcast, because that was also a good show. So
that was a good one. Oh, cool. So my ending question, since we're doom and gloom there for a second, what makes you feel hopeful for the future, or what's something that would? What's a good trend you see?
Well, I think I think everything comes in cycles, and so I think that when it's winter, that spring will come again. So, and I think that people are resilient, and they've lived through way worse than what we're living through, even if it's a very alienating time to be alive. People lived through the Black Plague, and people lived through the 30 Years' War and through World War I. So we kind of need to suck it up. And our cross to bear is this crisis of meaning and income inequality and all the identity politics tensions. And, it's our job to take that on. So let's do it. Not be doomers.
Absolutely. That's a a great note to end on. Let's not be doomers. Well, Theresa, I appreciate you coming on so much, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Awesome. Great to talk to you.
All right, thanks a lot.